education program for high school students, emphasizing hands-on, team-oriented problem solving and community involvement that prepares young people for environmental careers and active citizenship. Even though this is not the way we or anyone wanted the year to go, we're glad to have you here this afternoon to officially launch our webinar series so that we can keep learning together even though we are apart. I'm honored to be introducing today's webinar series kickoff speaker, Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, who is also a former Envirothon participant. Kathleen Theoharides has served as Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs in the Baker-Polito administration since May 2019. Secretary joined the administration in 2016 as the Director of Climate and Global Warming Solutions, and later served as Assistant Secretary as well as Undersecretary of Climate Change. The Secretary oversees the Commonwealth's 6 environmental, natural resource, and energy regulatory agencies, guiding the administration's efforts to address climate change, protect and enhance Massachusetts' environmental resources, and build a clean, reliable, and affordable energy future for the state's residents. Trained as a field biologist, the Secretary received a BA in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from Dartmouth College and a Master's of Science in Ecology and Environmental Biology from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. The Secretary was raised in Western Massachusetts and currently lives in Arlington with her husband and 3 young children. On behalf of the Mass Envirothon Steering Committee, we would like to thank the Secretary for taking time out of her busy schedule to join us and for her unending and continued support of the Envirothon program. I want to encourage everyone in attendance to ask questions, as she'll be leaving time at the end to answer. We ask that you do this by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'd also ask you to type in your name and from what school or organization you are from. I also would like to remind everyone that this session is being recorded and will be available on the Mass Envirothon website at massenvirothon.org. Thank you and welcome, Secretary.
Thank you very much, Kelly, and thank you to the Massachusetts Envirothon for organizing the workshop and for all of the students and their teachers and their Envirothon teams for engaging in these important issues. I was reflecting on a pre-workshop I did when I was in the Envirothon in high school, and it was at UMass Amherst, and it was a retreat. So we all stayed in the hotel with our teams, and I think stayed up till 3 o'clock in the morning eating gigantic cookies from the cafeteria. And I am sorry that that's not the type of thing that gets to go on this year, but I'm glad that the pandemic isn't shifting anyone's attention away from lending your passion and knowledge to the fight for the environment. I think we've certainly seen at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs and across our agencies, the importance of our natural and working lands, our forests, our water supply, clean air, and the impacts climate change can have, and certainly how important our parks and other green spaces have been during the pandemic. And it has given us renewed energy, I think, in difficult times to really dig in and make sure that these resources continue to provide the backbone, really, of a resilient state and a resilient country. On climate change, it's something we've been focusing on under Governor Baker's leadership for quite some time now in Massachusetts, and working with a number of other states across the country on ways to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and to prepare our community for climate change impacts that are already happening. Earlier this year, Governor Baker committed Massachusetts to an aggressive target of net zero emissions by 2050. This puts us up with a couple of countries in Europe and a couple of states in the US as having one of the most ambitious climate goals in the world. And so what is net zero? Net zero means we're going to work in Massachusetts to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by at least 85% below where they were in 1990 levels by the year 2050. And then we work to actively remove the rest of the carbon in the air through tree planting, forest and land conservation, and the preservation of other important natural resources like wetlands to actually remove and store carbon from the atmosphere. We have to pursue a whole suite of different strategies, as you can imagine, to chase down that goal. We are right around 23%, 22% below 1990 levels right now. We have to get to 25% by 2020. We're on target to do that. But to hit these next targets, we really have to use all of the new technologies at our disposal in terms of renewable energy, solar, wind, hydropower, storage. We have to make our homes and businesses and buildings more efficient so they use less energy. And we also have to make our transportation system cleaner by promoting people to switch from standard vehicles, internal combustion engines, to electric vehicles, and also to improve public transit and improve the walkability of our cities and towns. Over the past year, we've been working on what we call our 2050 roadmap to identify the ways we can reduce our emissions and reach this aggressive target. And we're looking forward to rolling out our policies and strategies to get there, including the management of water resources. So that makes discussions like the one we're having today particularly valuable. We're already seeing the impacts of climate change as we continue to work to draw emissions down. And so the focus on adapting to those climate change impacts has also been something we're working on. In Massachusetts, we've seen temperature has been steadily rising, as has sea levels, along with sinking or subsidence of land all along our coast. This summer, we had actually a critical drought that has been affecting water supplies, natural resources, wildlife, and farms across the state. And while we're finally seeing rainfall again, including for many of us today, this dry period, we went down into it really fast. So we had what folks are calling a flash drought, basically, where we entered into the drought very quickly in the spring. And many crops were damaged, local wells and water suppliers were getting quite low. New wells had to be dug in some locations, and aquatic wildlife and plants around the state also suffered. It also made some of our trees more vulnerable to blowdowns, and we actually saw some of that in the derecho we experienced back in October. Derecho is one of those straight line storms with high winds, and we saw trees fall in ways they typically don't. In part, folks think because of the shorter root systems this year due to the drought. All of this comes on the heels of several years of record-breaking nor'easters, historic snowfalls, and other severe storms. But I think in all of this, perhaps the biggest impact we're set to see here in the Northeast is and will be on water resources. Our precipitation has changed over the last several decades. One thing we are seeing a lot more of is more high volume, short duration events that last a few hours to maybe a day, with a really high intensity of rainfall. And often this rainfall is not well absorbed, but leads to overland runoff and significant flooding events. Our infrastructure was not built for this level of rainfall, and so it often has trouble keeping up, and we do see flooding as a result. And I think sometimes people think about a drought year and a flood year as different things, but back in 2016, which was our biggest drought to date, we saw a severe flooding event in the city of Worcester that happened over multiple days from just one single storm event. So these types of events occurring at the same time are very possible, and we've already seen them. The amount of rainfall we see on an annual basis is also increasing. Just 15 to 20 years ago, we were at about 44 inches a year. We're now up to about 48 inches a year. And again, beyond just the average, the intensity and frequency of high rainfall events is increasing here in the Northeast more than it is in any other part of the country. I think in addition, something that's very important is that we're seeing changes in the form of precipitation. So in the winter, we're not getting as much snow, and much of the precipitation we're seeing is rain, although there have been some crazy years with really high volume of snow like 2015. And with higher temperatures, we will see more of this shifting from snow to rain or to rain and ice, which is really a least favorite on my list, winter ice instead of winter snow. But this obviously will have an impact on plant and animal communities, but also on our recreational activities and winter sports and many of the small businesses that depend on these industries, whether it's snowmobiling or cross-country and downhill skiing, snowshoeing, other types of things that people come to Massachusetts and New England for. These things are likely to take a hit. Other things that may change, some species like maple trees could disappear, and we may see new species from further south migrating to our state, as well as the spread of more invasive species of plants and animals. It takes a lot more in some ways for people to adapt because we're used to approaching things in certain ways, and we also have to make significant investments in our infrastructure in our communities. And one of those key, I think, sort of adaptations that we need to focus on is designing better, locating critical infrastructure in our houses and businesses away from flood-prone areas, and becoming more efficient in our use of water so that we can stretch out our water supplies for a long time and make sure we're minimizing our impact on drought conditions. And then also making sure that we're allowing water to recharge into the ground and not creating impermeable surfaces over all of our open space. On a more positive note, our understanding of climate change here in the state and how it will impact our own resources is growing every day. As a state, we've made many investments during Governor Baker's tenure, and we've worked with many partners, including UMass Amherst and many of the colleges in our state system to better understand the impacts we'll be seeing. And every day our cities and towns are thinking about climate change and working with the state to plan for the impacts in our communities. We have a program called our Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness, or MVP program, and that helps cities and towns across the Commonwealth plan and take action to prepare for the impacts of climate change and to increase their resiliency. We've been giving out about $11 million a year through that program. And we now have almost 90% of the communities across the state enrolled. So since 2017, we've invested about $44 million. But I would encourage any of the teams to look into their community and see if you're already enrolled in MVP. If you're not, this is definitely something that a group of students could take on, helping the community apply for and access these grants, and actually working through the planning process and helping to identify real priorities. And we've had a couple of high school groups get involved. It's been a lot of fun to see the creativity that comes along with that. I also wanted to mention our Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, where a lot of our focus on making water infrastructure more resilient has been. We know that predictions for sea level rise, storm surges, and increased flooding frequency could severely impact operations such as water treatment facilities and related really critical infrastructure. And these are things that when they break down due to loss of power can release dirty water into our rivers and ocean areas. So Mass DEP has worked on a program called the Water Utility Resilience Program to support drinking water and wastewater utilities, help them install green backup systems, and build resilience to the threats of climate change. The program helps ensure that overall climate change resiliency is part of their planning approach, and to make sure they continue to provide service as we experience some of these impacts going forward. Mass DEP has also been working to mitigate the effects of coastal storms and flooding and reducing damage to property, infrastructure, and the environment. And so this is really just a snapshot. We have any number of water and climate programs across our agencies and are always looking for new ideas. But I think these issues, it's terrific that the Envirothon is taking on these issues this year. And I feel very lucky that we have such an engaged group to work on these challenges and encourage encourage you all to pursue this line of work in the future. They'll be the problem solvers of tomorrow. And I'd also encourage you to access some of the state programs and to look for partners in state agencies. My own Envirothon project back in high school actually led me to work with a forester who was at the time at the Department of Environmental Management, which is now part of DER. And our class had the luck to write him, DCR. Our class had the luck to write him a letter and he responded, and we worked together with members of our community to release a biological control agent for an invasive species that was decimating hemlocks. But it was such a great way to learn about how state agencies worked and to get the deep knowledge and experience of a forester, and then to take that learning to more of the advocacy side with our town planning offices, with meetings with residents, and then actually to work on raising money for the biological control agent itself. So I think this is just such a rich program for students, and really pleased to be a very small part of it today. And I'm more than happy to take some questions.
All right, so a reminder, people can type your questions in the question and answer section. This is Britta. Hi, thank you so much. Could you talk a little bit about getting from being an Envirothon team member to being Secretary of EoEEA state? That's really cool.
Sure. So, you know, pre-Envirothon, I always knew I was interested in these issues. I had parents who were very into nature and going outside. And so that was sort of formative in my experience. After high school, in college, I was on a pre-med track, but I knew that I was interested really in environmental biology and ecology. And so I ended up focusing on that and just had any number of field and lab classes outside doing field work, whether it was counting the numbers of peeps that spring peepers make at night to either deter predators or attract mates, or studying beaver dams or collecting leaves in the fall for different things. That was, you know, the experience of being able to do hands-on field work in college really cemented my love for environmental biology. I also did several summer internships, one at Harvard Forest, which is here in Massachusetts, where a student works with a researcher all summer and takes on an independent project and really learns sort of the scientific process, soup to nuts, from designing a process to writing up a paper and presenting it at the end in a poster session. I went to grad school very quickly after college at UMass Boston, and that was also, I think, really important. I learned about, first of all, teaching. I had to teach undergraduates, and that was a great experience for learning how to talk about the work you're doing and scientific concepts generally. But I also had the fortune to take my first environmental policy class. And I think that reminded me of this passion, not just for the science, but also for the translation of the science to action. And so shortly after that, I went down to DC and interned working on the 2008 Farm Bill, and then got into environmental policy, stayed down in DC for 3 years working for Defenders of Wildlife, which is a big conservation organization down there, and then came back up to Massachusetts and started at EEA in 2016. So a little bit of a a long answer there, but I did really start with the policy and start with the science and come to the policy piece of it later.
Secretary, we've got a question, from Will Snyder over in Amherst. He's wondering if you could speak a little bit more on how communities can take action locally on the water issue related to climate change.
Yes, so I can talk, I think, combine them because the MVP program is a great program to address water issues. So the requirement of MVP is that communities go through a process. It's a short process, a planning process, 8 or 16 hours basically, where the community works through their key vulnerabilities, key opportunities, and develops a list of actions for the future. And often we've seen that these actions tend to deal with water-related challenges in their community, whether it's something as simple as a culvert that needs to be right-sized to allow passage of wildlife and water, and also to address the increased volume of storms we're going to see. But it can be something like that, or it can be something more full scale. In Millbury last summer, we funded an action grant, which is sort of the follow-on to the planning grant, to do a whole downtown flood water attenuation plan using rain gardens and other green infrastructure techniques to allow the water to infiltrate into an area that was heavily concrete, heavily impervious. So that addressed not only the water issue, but also the accessibility and sort of the economic development potential in the downtown. We also have programs through our Division of Ecological Restoration that fund things like culverts, dam removals, wetland restoration, and other projects. Those can also be funded through MVP as well. So MVP is another pot. The nice thing about MVP is that once a town goes through the planning process, which we will pay you for, then you have access to this pot of action grant money, which funds the design and permitting stages of projects, as well as the build out of projects. And so we are seeing about $11 million annually, sometimes a little bit more than that, that goes to those types of projects, many of which can include water issues. And I think, the thing about the MVP plans is it really matters who's in the room. And so getting more community members educated about the water challenges in their community has been one of the things we've seen a lot of our local conservation partners really get involved in to make sure that all of those issues are on the table. But often, because the MVP workshops require sort of the full town staff to be involved, there is a recognition from folks like DPW, from the local conservation commission, of where some of these challenges have been in the past. And so it often leads to a community making some strategic decisions around water infrastructure, around nature-based solutions that could be implemented to address water challenges that can really, then we can apply some good funding to at the state level. We now have, I should mention, we now have a regional coordinator in every part of the state who works just on MVP. So that's a resource we could pass along to this group.
Secretary, do you want to explain what MVP stands for? I see a question from Jamie.
Sure. So MVP is the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. Kind of a wonky list of words to get to the acronym, but it really is focused on addressing vulnerability to climate change at the local level. And the reason we designed it that way was because we wanted to help. We were already seeing a lot of cities and towns thinking about the issue, and we wanted to provide a framework that wouldn't have communities planning for the next 10 years, but would sort of be planning light and it allows for more planning work, feasibility studies, design studies, but it focuses on just getting an action plan in place of what you're going to do next, what you think your biggest risks are, and it includes climate change data that was developed by UMass Amherst just for our state, and you know, sort of in a package form. And then we trained something on the order of 350 vendors around the state to be able to lead these sessions. Many of them have actually been graduate students, and we had some high school students take the training as well. But for the most part, it's consultants and folks at universities. And then a key part of this is the town takes it on and sends out invitations and really ensures that there's good participation in this planning session. And then it goes from planning to applying for action grants. And now that we've had our coordinators in place for about a year, there is significant help available for smaller communities who don't have professional grant writers or don't have resources to spend the time on applying for grants. They're also, the planning grant itself is very simple. The action grant is a little bit more involved, as you can imagine.
Secretary, I see a question from Justin. I believe Justin is a coach. He was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the state's net zero carbon goal by 2050 and the roles that renewables will play.
Sure. So we need a lot more renewables on the grid. And then we also need to plug more things into the grid and also increase our energy efficiency, so we're using less overall. So we sort of have, you know, a three-pronged big picture strategy: clean up our generation, and that's the renewable side; electrify sectors that aren't currently electrified, that's building and transportation, so that we can plug in our cars and our buildings essentially to that clean generation, rather than using petroleum and rather than using gas or oil to heat our homes. And then finally, energy efficiency, which the state has been doing for many years, and we're actually nation leading in. We have to keep doing that, particularly to our old building stock that hasn't been retrofitted, to make sure that we're using as little energy as possible when we are electrifying. But on the renewable front, we are looking at a number of things to get to net zero. We're looking at significant additional offshore wind resources. So really ramping up the work we're doing on offshore wind as we go out towards 2050. And we'll be doing something like a major wind project every couple of years, it looks like. And so that's something that's great, is that we have 2 now in the pipeline, in the permitting process, and should get one of them in the beginning stages of building very shortly. Solar will continue to be important. Something that's important to us is making sure that as solar is sited, it's not chopping up our farms and forest lands. It's being sited, A, where it's needed, which tends to be closer to urban areas, and then B, in a way that's utilizing land efficiently and really not cutting into our natural resources. And then there's also a big role for hydropower, which is something we've been pursuing as well. And we're in the process of getting a transmission line down through Maine from Canada to access hydropower, which is something that, unlike wind and sun, sometimes the wind isn't blowing, sometimes the sun isn't shining. Hydropower is a much more stable baseload resource that can provide reliability as well as clean power. So there's a lot of opportunity there. There's other, there's certainly other things that are coming online. People are looking at things like nuclear fusion, as well as the possibility of at least retaining nuclear power plants is important, but even the possibility of new, safer nuclear development. But renewables are kind of the key piece we see here, and something we continue to look at ramping up. and a critical piece of with all of those renewables is storage to make sure that we can help control peak surges and deal with things like times when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing.
I think we've got time for one more. I see a question. Is more water power an option in Massachusetts watersheds? That might be a good question related to Water Management Secretary.
Vicki, I can't see the question. Sorry, can you repeat it again?
Sure. Is more water power an option in Massachusetts watersheds?
So we do have a great, for any of you who are from Western Mass, we have some great hydropower, local hydropower out at Northfield Mountain and in several other locations along the Deerfield River. And so water storage is an option on currently on some of our rivers here in the state. And there always has to be a balance between making sure the river is able to function properly in terms of the ecology and the wildlife. Many of these resources are also really used for fishing as well as whitewater rafting. So we're actually just in the process right now of reviewing some of the permitting associated with one of the major hydro dams in Massachusetts. And what that means is we're trying to balance a number of different uses for the river, which include all three of the ones I mentioned: whitewater rafting, fishing, and the production of hydropower from the river, as well as endangered dragonflies and fish species. So I think with any renewable resource, there are challenges associated with being really responsible about where you put the resource and how you manage it. But that being said, we do have a lot of old dams here in the state, and I think it is something people have brought up from time to time. Are any of those dams worth taking a look at and repurposing for hydropower today? Many of our mills in our mill towns were run entirely on the power of water, and so that is something we have. We are in the process of removing a lot of those dams because they impede ecological flow and wildlife passage and water quality. But there may be opportunities in the future for other dams to be rebuilt and generate some of the power. But as I mentioned, there are already some really great resources in the western part of the state.
Thanks, Secretary. I think we've got time for one more. I see one from Mr. Evan Dalton. He's asking if there are any plans for statewide initiatives that encourage lowering human usage of resources like electricity and fossil fuels.
Great. And I'm sorry, I have a lot of background noise in my house all of a sudden with the kids. But so our biggest program for reducing electric use is our Mass Save energy efficiency program. And for any of you that haven't had something like this at your home, Mass Save comes and does an audit of your home and looks for places where you're losing energy. And so this can be your walls. We just had our walls insulated actually by Mass Save, and it was entirely free. They'll do it for free. So they'll come. If you have an old house like I do where heat just escapes through your walls, they will come and put insulation in your walls and bring it up to the standards they build to today. They also do things like look at your windows. They have a loan program for windows. They replace light bulbs. They look at your boiler or your furnace. They can help you convert from a oil heater to a heat pump. We do have a number of programs that provide rebates on heat pumps, which are an electric way to generate your heat. Instead of using oil and gas, you plug into what's becoming a cleaner and cleaner electric generating system. But we always think of our first line of reducing our emissions, reducing our energy consumption overall through energy efficiency. So that has been and will continue to be a really big focus. And one of the things we're doing right now is working on of a next generation building code. And so the building code dictates how builders have to build houses, and what rules they have to follow when they're constructing those houses. And so we're looking at trying to make sure that the houses that are built today are built to be compliant with a net zero goal in 2050, because they'll be around in 2050. And so how do you make sure a house is as efficient as it possibly can, has an electric heat pump, has windows and insulation and all of the other things that go into a house that would bring it up to that net zero goal that we have in the future, so that anything new doesn't need to be retrofitted, is really built today the way it has to be.
Thank you so much, Secretary Theoharides, for being here with us today. We so appreciate your time and information, and we're looking forward to hearing from other EEA staff in the future and our other webinars that are happening this fall.
Great. Well, thank you, Britta, and thank you, Kelly. It's been a pleasure, and thank you all for attending. Good luck.
Thanks so much. Bye, everybody. See you next time.